So in my introduction, I also use the opportunity to give our view on, what Black Mountain meant and how we want to approach this community and art school. The Black Mountain College was founded on the outskirts of a small North Carolina mountain town in 1933 and closed down 24 years later in 1957. The college was established with the aim of providing an education in the arts and sciences, loosening conventional distinctions between student and faculty and administration that usually served to specialize roles and bolster hierarchical distinctions. With minimal structure, born both out of idealistic inclination and economic necessity, Black Mountain's experiment in education would prove innovative yet provisional and ultimately untenable. Black Mountain's college institutional organization was, in other words, peculiar and problematic. However, it developed an unprecedented, prominent genealogy of artists, scientists, and intellectuals, mainly consisting of an elite of European exiles from Nazi Germany, as well as prominent post-war American neo-avant-garde. The breadth of famous participants, amongst them Joseph and Annie Albers, Ruth Sava, John Cage, Merth Cunningham, Buckminster Fuller, Clement Greenberg, Walter Gropius, Willem de Koning, Robert Rauschenberg, Savi Shavinsky, or Thai Twombly, is until today most impressive. Two works of the collection marks at the Hamburger Bahnhof Museum für Gegenwart, Berlin, one by Robert Rauschenberg and the other by Thai Twombly, were created at Black Mountain College in 1951 and 1952 and stimulated the first ideas for the curators Eugen Blume and Gabriele Knappstein to develop the forthcoming exhibition Black Mountain Teaching and Learning as Performing Arts in June 2015. Our cooperation between the museum and the Freie Universität aims at a multifaceted exchange involving students and educational institutions in various activities, as well as including digital platforms such as a blog open to the general public to approach this complex subjects from various perspectives. During the 3-year collaboration, our goal is not a reconstruction of aspects of Black Mountain's history and the wide spectrum of important work being done during its existence. Our goal is rather a reflection and potential reactivation of models of creativity in this institution in a broader sense. In our today's workshop, we are very honored to bring together a group of distinguished scholars and artists to discuss the category of creative dynamics in art, sciences, and education, as well as the dynamics of creativity in education and society, which unfolded at Black Mountain College. In my today's introduction to our workshop, Black Mountain Models of Creativity, I will try to highlight some aspects of our approach to Black Mountain and the models of creativity unfolded there, which included 3 factors, in my and our opinion: risk-taking, community life, and experimentation. I come to my first point, risk-taking in education teaching. Put together Europeans and Americans, educated and uneducated, lazy and energetic, the left and the right. Add to this the snobberies of the artists and intellectuals, and one can easily see how fertile it was for problems, but this also created opportunities for problem solving. These and other statements underpin the atmosphere of education at Black Mountain. As an institution, it did not function as an harmoniously structured community, where everyone was in their specific place, taken up with the duty allocated to them, equipped with a proper pedagogical, artistic, or intellectual skills. Instead, Black Mountain nurtured a paradigm shift from the roles of the teacher or a student as a given social position, oftentimes in disruptive ways. Yet, Black Mountain unfolded community processes to set off unprecedented capacities in co-creation and collaboration. The pedagogical practices at Black Mountain invite to think about educational practices beyond passivity and activity oppositions, as well as body-mind dualisms, aiming at educating the whole person in more than a logocentric accord. Teaching method were counting on active students on a mental as well practical and physical level, constantly trying to provoke their minds to further actions. Although there were no required courses, no set schedule of examinations, and no formal grades, the education at Black Mountain was extremely demanding. Accordingly, one student remembered, quote, "If you didn't bring something new to every single class, a new idea or a piece of work, you just didn't want to show up." In summer 1948, the inventor Buckminster Fuller constructed his first geodesic dome, a human shelter construction. Though in its early constructions it failed to rise and was called the Supine Dome by Elaine de Koning, one of Fuller's students. This design, however, was ultimately successful and became an architectural model worldwide a few decades later. Trial and error, or even failure in many ways, became at times a truly liberating force at Black Mountain, opposing a predetermined path towards knowledge, actions, or results. The necessity of making mistakes, as Buckminster Fuller has prominently declared, was considered as part of the pedagogical practices and a key factor in the interplay of opposites and contradictions. The possibility of failure indeed shifts the focus from a final result to the potentiality or inactuality as described by Giorgio Agamben, but also to experiences of disturbance, frustration, and disorientation for all people involved. However, the constant regeneration and renegotiation of self-organizing patterns at work was able to generate a common sense of co-creation and co-evolution, allowing the interplay of various people and disciplines. A syllabus of teaching was not a fixed entity, but rather collectively elaborated and generated through a constant shift between various formats of perception, practice, presentation, and representation. One of the most famous examples of such a class are Josef Albers' Farbexperimente. In Albers' words, quote, "What counts here, first and last, is not the so-called knowledge of so-called facts, but vision, seeing. Seeing here implies schauen and is coupled with fantasy and imagination." And a student commented, Albers, quote, "Albers was not interested in creating treatises on color. He was not giving rules about colors. He was giving us tools to unlock what he considered the magic of color." This understanding of education as co-creativity implies that learning as well as teaching are carried out as performative processes that unfold themselves while happening, consisting of an ever-changing set of processes that manifest themselves while they are acted out. Albers accordingly proclaimed a healthy belief that there is no final solution in form, thus for demands unending performances and invites constant considerations, visually as well as verbally, end of quote. Black Mountain thus unfolded an educational model that addressed as well as in part transgressed all the binaries like active-passive, body-mind, master-student, art, and science by reveling an interplay of opposites that open up a creative space of communitarian creative practices. This ideal-sounding concept was, however, deeply rooted in pragmatism. The so-called work program at Black Mountain mirrored nothing but a pragmatic eclecticism of tasks to be fulfilled by everybody, necessary to sustain the life on campus. In the memory of the student Mary Gregory, quote, We had graduate architectural students sent to us to get practical experience in building. We did build several buildings designed by faculty and students. We did have a farm which supplied meat, milk, vegetables. There was a woodworking shop where we built furnishings, lab equipment, utensils for parties, and a small house for a pig. Our labor was needed. End of quote. This work experience program was crucial, particularly in the world at war, as well as in the post-war world. Art, quote, art at Black Mountain College is based upon art as an active, appreciative, and creative force, premating all activities of life. This is a quote from the Black Mountain Bulletin. This is an image where the students and the faculty departs for working in the work program. The velocity of exchange between art and life, as well as various art forms and sciences, can be illustrated by numerous examples. For instance, the glyph, so-called glyph exchange in summer 1951, and I choose this because everybody is always mostly referring to Untitled event, but glyph exchange in 1951 is another example for what was happening there. So the glyph exchange in summer 1951 was directly precipitated by an encounter with Southern racial politics and a productive misunderstanding. The poet Charles Olson, he was also later a director of the school, the poet Charles Olson was in town from Black Mountain with Alvin Lipsey, a young nephew of the college's black cook, where they encountered a local auction. The boy exclaimed, "It's like a race," and Olson, started by the allusion to slave auctions, wrote a brief and probably spontaneous poem about the scene and gave it to the painter Ben Shawn, who was at the college for the summer. Returning this poem gift, Shane painted a glyph for Charles, produced like several other works he completed at the college, in what he termed a palimpsest style without erasures of any kind. Lou Harrison, in his turn, an associate of Cage, hired in Cage's absence, composed then a work entitled The Glyph for the Prepared Piano. And then he gave this composition to the dancer Catherine Liz. And she then choreographed a dance using the Harrison score and an enlarged vision of Shawn's painting as the design for the dance. This kind of synergetic attitude of collaboration among the colleagues at the college speaks or is an example for a very practical response and also an improvisatory change and an immediate collaboration, which was very typical for Black Mountain. And as Liz stated, the common idea of a glyph expressed by different art forms was simply a compound image contained in a single work. These and other forms of collaboration and exchange were embedded in a basic disposition of risk-taking at Black Mountain and unfolded itself as experimentation. This is maybe not a good image for experimentation, but it shows something we mostly don't experience in our academic life, or maybe also in our work life. In some corporations you find that, but most of the people at Black Mountain said this was actually the space, the dining hall was the space where all this exchange and dialogue about this work took place, and also it was the space which they used in the evenings for all kinds of performative, what we call now performative events or happenings, because all the artwork which took place there kind of, even in this time, defied a kind of, categorization as dance or as single theater and so on. So, so my point is now that experimentation was the key kind of glue or factor which made all these processes happening. So experiment was the key word of this institution, not creativity. In 1938, Annie Albers wrote an article in this really very interesting Black Mountain College bulletin, which was called Work with Material. Work with Material. And where she explicitly referred to experimentation and the development of a personality. She says, free experimentation can result in the fulfillment of an inner urge to give form and to give permanence to ideas. That is to say, it can result in art, or it can result in satisfaction of invention of some more technical way. So these two weren't separated there. But most important to one's growth is to see oneself leave the safe ground of an accepted convention and to find oneself alone and self-dependent. It is an adventure which can premate one's own whole being. Thus, experiments at Black Mountains were a strategy to actively stimulate the processes of artistic and scientific production, used as a mediator to negotiate between artists, students, and their projects, and last but not least, their very different personalities. Experimental practices were performing life, art, and scientific investigations as community experiences on a daily basis. With small classes and one-to-one tutoring, students and faculty were in close everyday contact. Meals were eaten together, and students often told that they learned as much over mealtime conversations as they did in classrooms. The dining hall of Black Mountain was a locus of intellectual and creative activity, and hosted, among many other events, the now famous Untitled event in 1952. The dynamics between the functioning of a college as a community and experiments as collective activities was nurtured by diverse and often contradictory concepts between teachers of what experiments meant and how they were conducted. For Albert's experiment, in his words, quote, embraces all means opposing disorder and accident, a very different concept from Cage and others. It represents a careful procedure of testing socially and historically constructed perceptual understandings in art against deceptive optical registrations. To Cage, experiment ruptures the patterns of reasoning with hypothetical testable limits. As he stated, quote, the word experimental is apt, providing it is understood not as a descriptive of an act to be later judged in terms of success or failure, but simply as an act where the outcome of which is unknown. Simply as an act, the outcome of which is unknown. In Fuller's model, however, experimental procedures are those by which the valid data what was really going on in nature can be formulated conceptually by artists. He, by the way, also called artists comprehensive designers, and thereby, in Fuller's conception, exposing the conventionalized knowledge claims myth, what he called myth, and an overly specialized society. Experiments at Black Mountain were actions marking what Deleuze coined the cleavage of causality, expanding the pure cognitive notion of knowledge which is based on understanding the logical chain of cause and effect or action and reaction. Experiments at Black Mountain hardly determined knowledge, they rather offered fluid structures of experiences. Consequently, prominent artists and scientists began to reconceptualize their understanding of an experiment by a number of experiments. A notion of the experiment that provoked an engagement with the uncertain, highlighting what was contingence, indeterminacy, and chance, with an emphasis on the ephemeral and incomplete, in contrast to permanence and durability. Experiments in that sense sort out potentiality without focusing on a required degree of innovation, evidence, or efficiencies. Experiments were, so to speak, the precarious glue interweaving various models and practices of creativity, specifically constructed to construct work environments that immerse the participants in an experience of collective creation. And there's another key example I choose also from our discussions with Eugen Blum and Gabriele Knappstein, which stems from the Bauhaus. There's so many numerous examples that it's hard to make, you know, a proper and valid selection. But I think one of the very important people there was Chanty Chavinsky. He's not so well known, but I think he was very important. because he was really very strongly influenced by the Bauhaus theatrical tradition, and he was indeed a student of the Bauhaus master Oskar Schlemmer, and he taught also in the early phase of the Black Mountain College there, and he, interestingly enough, he had developed a concept which he called spectrodrama. In the 1970s, it was published. It's called Spectrodrama, Play, Life, and Illusion. And there he said, that's very interesting also for us, looking at the history of performance and the question of how we interweave performance culture and what the history of that is. He proclaimed, that's very interesting for the 1930s, quote, also in English, that's not a translation, quote, that we arrive at a theater of knowledge. And he says, if so, to this purpose, teaching and learning are shifted in regular intervals, the classroom to a stage as a practice ground and a laboratory for demonstration. And Stravinsky continues, the working together of scientists, artists, economists, musicians, composers, psychologists, engineers, and sociologists thus becomes a reality in which sharp boundary lines disappear and give way to the free interacting flow of thought, idea, and knowledge, end of quote. So experiments were supposed to invoking trials of new or different experiences in which intentions or results are not forecast beforehand, but rather in the works of Buckminster Fuller were initiating, quote, what Fuller said, a search for tasks that needed to be done that no one else was attempting to do. And now I come to my last point. What are the consequences, or what is the impact for us today, and how can we also critically understand our notion of creativity and collaboration, and also working as scientists together? This is a very famous photo, by the way, from one of the summer sessions, which became kind of iconic and also a model for many colleges and schools later on, because every college, especially in the US, has a very prestigious summer school now where they invite famous people to teach and collaborate. So I come to my last point, creativity today, or the questions, or the critical questions we should raise in this context. In contemporary society, and particularly the economy, creativity has become a key concept and an actual force of transformation. Creativity serves as an unquestioned mantra of collective and institutionalized practices. It is the key strategy of innovation, efficiency, or even perfection. There is no recent theory of collaborations that does not emphasize the importance of self-organization and the collective production, stressing the fact that the participants' involvement entails physical action and their experience of interactive practices is both effective and embodied. In other words, participants ideally experience a sense of shared growth and development as they together are responsible for the creation of the work or production in general. Modernist aesthetics called in a long tradition for a radical rethinking of the divide between production and consumption. Paradoxically, co-creation, co-production, and participation as key concepts in the field of cultural creation have indeed helped to redefine post-capitalistic ideologies of production to be re-articulated as cultural or even artistic endeavor. And in turn, the spheres of art and academia have become increasingly bound to post-industrial economic structures, where terms such as creativity now circulate as hard currency in the branding of corporations and universities alike. The increasing value placed on cultural capital, really in Bourdieu's formulation, and the rise of the so-called experience economy have blurred the lines between production and consumption, making it increasingly difficult to define what constitutes creativity and to define what it is used for and to what ends. So our workshop also aims at challenging the notion of creativity as an increasingly blurred category and an unprecedented force in the creative economy, as well as the educational institutions. How, where, and for whom exist spaces for risk-taking, community life, and experimentation, if at all? By looking at the ideologies of creativity, we also aim at developing a critique of forced creativity intertwined with both the conception of self-cultivation as well as a creative self as an exploitable resource. In a climate of instability and forced austerity, academics, artists, and cultural workers face an increasingly precarious position. For some, present conditions challenge the very category of creativity altogether and give renewed urgency to the question of arts and humanities' purpose or even usefulness in a period of utilitarian educational regimes under the sign of post-Freudism. In which way could stimulating the discussion about Black Mountain work as a precursor for models of creativity and collaboration today? Which models of creativity serve best in overarching transdisciplinary concepts and practices to solve global problems, such as homelessness, hunger, or environmental disasters? Or, on contrary, is there a need for a profound criticism that tends to de-emphasize or even disavow creativity as a relevant category altogether? Black Mountain College in the 1930s until the 1950s and other alternative institutions in the late 1960s, such as the Free International University, founded by Joseph Beuys, had ideologically overlapping concepts in which the purpose of creativity was to educate the whole person, with a focus on the role of the arts and creative thinking in every profession, and thus imbuing arts and the humanities with crucial relevance for society. Drawing upon their legacy, there is a numerous spectrum of new institutions, reforms within institutions or even counter-institutions concerned with unfolding creativity, fostering scientific development and/or artistic critique. Today, the ideal of communitarian education as one of cooperation, collaboration, co-evolving with other humans is unquestioned, however, in reality often becoming a dead end of itself. How can both our institutions, the museum and the university, depending on the calibration of self-referential, ideological, bureaucratic, and financial factors, take on a role as a vital archive of past practices and models, as well as an incubator for future processes and a present tense laboratory for public education, provocation, and dialogue? Could creativity in this context unfold itself in form of experimental tactics, as defined, for instance, by Michel de Certeau? At this point, I would like to conclude my approach to Black Mountain and its legacy with a humble sense of incompletion and open-endedness, but last not least, referring to the perfect simplicity in which Joseph Albers explained his motivation to teach at this college. Upon his arrival at Black Mountain in 1933, Albers famously responded to his welcome ceremony at the college by simply stating, "I want to open eyes." Thank you.